Some stories should never be told. Welcome to Horror Stories.
Amherst, Nova Scotia, 1878. A landscape defined by its rugged maritime charm and chilling Atlantic winds. But on a late August evening, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and impending dread. A young woman, Esther Cox, stumbled through the doorway of her Princess Street home, drenched to the bone, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind her, the darkness of the storm seemed to press against the glass. Hungry for entry, what happened in the woods that night was a secret she intended to bury. But the shadows had other plans. This wasn't just a storm. It was the beginning of the Great Amherst Mystery, a sequence of events so violent, so inexplicable, that it would challenge the boundaries of Victorian science and leave a legacy of terror that remains unsolved to this day. Dim the lights, steady your nerves, and listen closely, because in this house, the walls don't just have ears, they have a message. To understand the horror, we must understand the setting. The Teed household was a crowded one, a typical two-story cottage filled with the echoes of a large family. There was Daniel Teed, a shoemaker, his wife Olive, and Olive's younger siblings, including the 18-year-old Esther. By all accounts, Esther was unremarkable, a quiet girl who helped with the chores and tended to the livestock. But after that fateful, rainy carriage ride with a man named Bob McNeil, the quiet was replaced by a suffocating tension. For a week, Esther remained a ghost in her own home, locking herself away, her eyes reflecting a trauma she couldn't articulate. Her sister Jane, who shared her bed, noted the change, the sudden, uncontrollable sobbing and the way Esther would jump at the slightest creak of a floorboard. The family assumed it was a lover's quarrel, a typical bout of nervous excitement, as the doctors of the era might call it. They were wrong. The trauma hadn't just broken Esther's spirit, it had opened a doorway. It began on the night of September 4th. The house was silent, settled into the deep stillness of the rural Canadian night. Suddenly, a scream ripped through the hallway. Esther leapt from her bed, convinced a mouse was scurrying beneath the covers. But as the sisters searched, they found nothing, until a cardboard box beneath the bed began to move. It didn't just slide, it leapt. Witnessed by Jane, the box levitated a foot off the floor, crashing down with a weight that defied its contents. The next night, the manifestations turned aggressive. Esther's body began to undergo a terrifying transformation. Her skin grew hot to the touch, her joints swelled to impossible sizes, and her eyes bulged as if under immense internal pressure. Then came the sounds, not just footsteps, but thunderous reports that shook the very foundations of the cottage. It was as if a sledgehammer was being driven into the walls by an unseen giant. And then, the scratching began. In the dim light of a flickering oil lamp, the family watched in absolute paralysis as scraggly, foot-high letters carved themselves into the plaster of the bedroom wall. The message was a death warrant, etched by an invisible hand. Esther Cox, you are mine to kill. The Great Amherst Mystery had arrived, and for Esther, the nightmare was only just beginning. To grasp the magnitude of the events that unfolded in Amherst, one must first look at the environment where it all took place. Princess Street was a quiet, unassuming stretch of road in a town defined by its industrial grit and Victorian order. The residence of Daniel Teed was not a place of isolation or Gothic mystery, it was a bustling, cramped two-story cottage, a hub of domestic activity. Living within these narrow walls were Daniel, his wife Olive, their two young sons, Daniel's brother John, and Olive's siblings, William, Jane, and the 18-year-old Esther Cox. In total, nearly 10 people shared a space that would feel tight by any modern standard. This detail is crucial. The Great Amherst Mystery did not happen in a vacuum or to a lonely individual in a secluded mansion. It happened in a house filled with witnesses, where privacy was a luxury and every sound echoed through the thin wooden partitions. Daniel Teed was a respected foreman at the local shoe factory, a man of practical mind and steady hand. His household was governed by routine, the tending of livestock, the hum of the factory whistle, and the communal meals that defined working-class life in 1878. Into this atmosphere of predictable stability, something chaotic was about to be introduced. The initial disturbances were subtle, the kind of occurrences one might dismiss as the settling of an old house or the tricks of a tired mind. But as the days following Esther's traumatic return from the marshlands progressed, the atmosphere inside the cottage grew palpably heavy. It began with the bedsheets. Jane, who shared a mattress with Esther, complained of a restless energy emanating from her sister. On the night of September 4th, the threshold of normalcy was finally crossed. As the sisters lay in the dark, a frantic scratching sound began beneath them. It wasn't the nibbling of a rodent, but a rhythmic, intentional scraping against the floorboards. When Jane lit the oil lamp, the sound stopped, only to be replaced by something far more defying of logic. A cardboard box filled with patchwork scraps, tucked securely under the bed, began to agitate. Both girls watched in stunned silence as the box slid out from the shadows of its own accord. Then, with a sudden, violent jerk, it levitated nearly a foot into the air before slamming back down. The impact was heavy enough to vibrate the floor. When Daniel Teed was summoned to the room, he found his sisters-in-law trembling, yet his pragmatic nature led him to laugh it off as girls' hysterics, or a prank played by the neighborhood boys. He told them to go back to sleep, unaware that the laws of physics in his home had just been suspended. By the following evening, the skeptics in the house were silenced. The phenomena had evolved from moving objects to a direct, physical assault on the senses. At approximately 10 p.m., Esther began to complain of an agonizing fever. As the family gathered around her, they witnessed a medical anomaly that no doctor in Amherst could initially explain. Esther's entire body began to swell visibly. Her hands, feet, and joints puffed up as if inflated by an internal pressure. Her skin became so hot that Olive Teed later reported it felt like touching a stove. Esther's eyes bulged, and she began to grind her teeth with such force it could be heard in the adjacent rooms. Suddenly, a sound like a clap of thunder erupted within the four walls of the bedroom. It was a dry, deafening report, no echoes, no vibrations from the outside world, just a localized explosion of sound that sent the family scurrying for cover. Olive, convinced the house had been struck by lightning, rushed to the window, but the night sky was clear and star-lit. There was no storm, only the terrifying reality that the electricity or energy seemed to be radiating directly from Esther herself. Just as the tension reached a breaking point, 3 more bangs, louder than the first, shook the bed frame. Then, as quickly as it had begun, Esther's swelling subsided, and she fell into a death-like sleep. The family sat in the flickering light, watching the girl breathe, realizing that whatever was happening was no longer a matter of moving boxes. It was an intelligent, aggressive force that was using Esther as its conduit. The mundane life of the Teed family had vanished, replaced by a daily struggle against an invisible intruder that was growing stronger with every passing hour. This was the end of the beginning. The quiet hauntings were over, and the violent era of the Amherst poltergeist was about to take center stage, drawing the eyes of the entire world to this small, terrified house on Princess Street. As the disturbances within the Teed cottage transitioned from eerie noises to physical manifestations, the family realized they were no longer dealing with a mere curiosity. Esther's health was deteriorating at an alarming rate. The swelling episodes, which had initially seemed like fleeting anomalies, became more frequent and agonizing. On the night of September 10, 1878, the situation reached a critical threshold. Esther was seized by a series of extraordinary spasms. Her body became rigid, her muscles locking with such intensity that her siblings could not bend her limbs. Her skin turned a deep, alarming crimson, and the heat radiating from her body was palpable even from several feet away. Terrified that Esther was suffering from an unknown and potentially fatal malady, Daniel Teed sought professional help. He summoned Dr. Carrit, a local physician known for his grounded, scientific approach. When the doctor arrived at the Princess Street home, he did so with deep skepticism, expecting to find a case of hysteria or perhaps a neglected infection. However, the scene awaiting him in the upstairs bedroom would challenge every medical tenet he had ever studied. Dr. Carrit sat by Esther's bedside, his watch in hand, attempting to find a rational pulse or a rhythmic pattern to her breathing. At first, the room was quiet. But as he began his examination, the atmosphere grew heavy with a static-like tension. Without warning, the pillow beneath Esther's head was violently yanked away by an invisible force. The doctor watched in disbelief as the pillow was pulled nearly a foot across the bed, thinking it might be a trick of the light or a mechanical prank. The doctor's assistant, John T., grabbed the corner of the pillow to pull it back. To his horror, the pillow was pulled back in the opposite direction. A literal tug-of-war ensued between a living man and an unseen entity. John reported that the force pulling against him was immense, possessing the strength of a grown man. When the entity finally let go, the pillow snapped back with such force that it struck Dr. Carrit. The physician, now alert and profoundly disturbed, began to search the room for hidden wires or magnets. He moved the bed to the center of the room, away from the walls, and checked the floorboards. There was nothing. No mechanisms, no trickery, only the raw, inexplicable movement of matter in a room filled with credible witnesses. The physical violence was not limited to objects. As Dr. Carrit continued his observation, a new and more terrifying sound emerged, a frantic, rhythmic scratching coming from the plaster wall directly behind Esther's head. It sounded like a sharp instrument being driven into the stone. The doctor held his lantern close to the wall, and before the eyes of everyone present, foot-high letters began to appear. They were not written in ink or blood, but were carved deeply into the very fabric of the house. The jagged, crude handwriting spelled out a sentence that would haunt the town of Amherst for decades. Esther Cox. You are mine to kill. This was the first time the entity had displayed a clear, murderous intent. The psychological impact on the family was devastating. This was no longer a spirit or an electrical current, it was a self-identified predator. Shortly after the writing appeared, the room was bombarded by a volley of small objects. Pieces of plaster, coins, and household utensils were hurled through the air, appearing to materialize from the ceiling. Dr. Carrit himself was struck by a piece of flying debris. He noted in his official observations that the objects did not follow the standard laws of ballistics. They often curved in midair or moved at speeds that should have caused far more damage upon impact. By the time Dr. Carrit left the Teed residence in the early hours of the morning, his skepticism had been replaced by a profound professional dilemma. He could find no physiological cause for Esther's swelling, nor could he explain the mechanical force required to carve letters into solid plaster in seconds. He tentatively labeled the condition as nervous excitement or extraordinary electricity. But his private notes reflected a deeper confusion. The news of the doctor's experience spread through Amherst like wildfire. If a man of science could not explain the events, what hope did the family have? The violence continued to escalate. Over the following days, the entity began to manifest, apports, objects appearing out of nowhere. A bucket of water in the kitchen was seen to boil without a heat source, and knives from the dining table were found embedded in the ceiling. Esther was now a prisoner in her own home, guarded by a family that was increasingly helpless against a force that had openly declared its intention to end her life. The case was no longer a local rumor, it was becoming a documented mystery, setting the stage for the arrival of outsiders who would seek to either help Esther or profit from her living nightmare. The medical intervention had failed to provide a cure, it had only provided a witness. By the spring of 1879, the atmospheric dread inside the Teed cottage had become a matter of public record. Word of the Amherst Mystery had traveled far beyond the borders of Nova Scotia, eventually reaching the ears of Walter Hubble. Hubble was an actor by trade, a man who spent his life studying human emotion, stagecraft, and the art of illusion. He arrived in Amherst not as a priest or a scientist, but as a professional skeptic with a keen eye for a commercial opportunity. Hubble's initial intent was clear. He believed Esther Cox was a clever fraud, and he intended to debunk her methods before a paying audience. He envisioned a lucrative lecture tour where you would present Esther as a curiosity, only to reveal the trick behind the manifestations. However, the moment Hubble stepped across the threshold of the Princess Street home, his theatrical confidence began to erode. Within 5 minutes of his arrival, his umbrella was snatched from his hand by an invisible force and hurled across the room. Moments later, a heavy carving knife materialized in midair, whistling past his head with lethal precision before embedding itself in the wall. Hubble, the man who thought he knew every trick in the book, found himself face to face with a reality that no stagehand could replicate. Despite his growing unease, Hubble proceeded with his plan to monetize the phenomenon. He convinced the family to allow Esther to go on a speaking tour, starting in nearby towns, but the entity following Esther, an entity that had now begun to identify itself through rhythmic knocks as Bob, did not care for the spotlight. The tour was a catastrophic failure. In the town of Chatham, the manifestations became so violent and unpredictable that the audience fled in a state of panic. Instead of a controlled demonstration, the stage became a zone of chaos. Objects from the local shops were reportedly apported onto the stage, and the deafening bangs that followed Esther made it impossible for Hubble to speak. The public, once curious, turned hostile, perceiving the events as either a dangerous hoax or a genuine diabolical presence. An angry mob eventually drove the group out of town, hurling rocks and insults. Hubble realized that Esther was not a performer, she was a victim. He abandoned the idea of a stage show but remained in the Teed household for several weeks, meticulously documenting the daily assaults in a journal that would later become the primary historical source for this case. As Hubble's stay continued through the summer, the manifestations took on a more sinister, pyromaniac quality. The entity's threats to burn the house down were no longer idle. Hubble recorded numerous instances where lit matches would seemingly rain from the ceiling. On one occasion, he watched as a box of matches on a high shelf ignited spontaneously, the flames leaping toward the curtains. The family lived in a state of constant, exhausting vigilance, carrying buckets of water from room to room. The entity seemed to take delight in the terror caused by fire. It wasn't just the house at risk. The very fabric of Esther's clothing would occasionally smolder and catch fire while she was wearing it. Hubble attempted to apply a scientific lens, suggesting that Esther's body was acting as a human battery, discharging massive amounts of kinetic and thermal energy. Yet, the intelligence behind the fires, the way they were strategically placed to cause maximum psychological distress, suggested something far more sentient than a mere physical anomaly. The cottage, once a place of safety, had become a tinderbox, and the community's sympathy was rapidly turning into fear. The violence against Esther reached its peak during this period. Hubble documented pulling dozens of sewing pins out of Esther's skin, pins that had been driven deep into her flesh by unseen hands while she slept. On several occasions, she was found with bloody scratches across her face and neck, as if clawed by a large animal. The entity, which Hubble now believed consisted of several distinct spirits, including the aggressive Bob Nickel, seemed intent on breaking Esther's spirit entirely. The actor-turned-investigator witnessed Esther being dragged out of her bed and tossed across the room, her nightgown shredded by invisible talons. No amount of prayer, medical sedation, or physical restraint seemed to hinder the assaults. Hubble's journals from this time describe a house under siege, where the boundary between our world and a darker dimension had worn thin. For Walter Hubble, the show was over. He was no longer looking for a trick, he was witnessing a slow-motion execution. The man of the theater had found a drama he could neither direct nor escape, leaving him to conclude that the great Amherst Mystery was not a hoax, but a terrifying glimpse into a violent, invisible world. For months, the residents of Amherst and the investigators watching Esther Cox were obsessed with the what and the how of the hauntings. They counted the knocks, measured the levitations, and documented the fires, but few had stopped to ask why. The answer finally emerged from the shadows of Esther's past, revealing a human horror far more grounded than any poltergeist. Shortly before the disturbances began in late August 1878, Esther had been involved with a local man named Bob McNeil. He was a man with a dark reputation, often described by townspeople as possessing a cruel streak. On a rainy evening that would change Esther's life forever, McNeil took her for a carriage ride into a desolate, marshy area on the outskirts of town. There, under the cover of a brewing storm, the romance turned into a nightmare. McNeil reportedly produced a revolver, pointed it at Esther, and attempted to force her out of the carriage with violent intent. It was only the sudden, fortuitous approach of another wagon that startled McNeil, causing him to drive Esther back to town at a breakneck speed, leaving her drenched, traumatized, and silent. The connection between this assault and the subsequent hauntings is impossible to ignore. In the Victorian era, the term post-traumatic stress disorder did not exist, but the symptoms were manifest. Esther had been subjected to a life-threatening encounter at the hands of a man named Bob. Interestingly, when the invisible entity in the Teed house finally began to communicate through knocks and voices, it identified itself by a specific name, Bob, while the entity claimed to be the spirit of a deceased shoemaker named Bob Nickel. The psychological resonance is undeniable. The Bob in the house mirrored the Bob in the marsh. Both were aggressive. Both threatened Esther's life, and both utilized tools of violence, such as knives and fire. To a modern observer, the Great Amherst Mystery begins to look less like a random haunting and more like a localized eruption of psychic distress. The trauma Esther could not speak of, the fear she had to suppress to survive in a crowded, judgmental household, seemed to find a physical outlet. This brings us to a bridge between the supernatural and the psychological, a theory that has come to define the study of poltergeist phenomena. Mainstream science and parapsychology often collide in cases like this, particularly through the theory of recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, or RSPK. This theory suggests that poltergeist activity is not caused by ghosts in the traditional sense, but by the unconscious mind of a living person under extreme emotional or mental strain. Esther Cox was a textbook candidate for this phenomenon. She was young, living in a highly repressed Victorian society, and had just survived a brutal attempted assault. According to this perspective, the energy observed by Dr. Carrit and Walter Hubble, the bangs that sounded like sledgehammers and the levitation of heavy objects, was actually Esther's own suppressed trauma manifesting in the physical world. Her mind, unable to process the terror of the revolver and the betrayal of Bob McNeil, may have projected that fear outward, creating a sentient-seeming entity that acted out her internal chaos. The fires, the scratching, and the threats were not just external attacks, they were the physical echoes of a shattered psyche. This doesn't make the events any less real. The knives were still sharp, and the fires were still hot, but it shifts the focus from the demon to the victim. However, the trauma theory faces a significant challenge: the witnesses. If this was merely a psychological projection, how did hundreds of people, including skeptical physicians and actors, see the objects move when Esther was not in the room? This is where the Great Amherst Mystery remains a deadlock. Whether it was a spirit seizing upon Esther's vulnerability or Esther's own mind tearing at the fabric of reality, the result was a symbiotic relationship of fear. The town of Amherst began to treat Esther as a pariah, a living magnet for disaster. The more the community feared her, the more intense the manifestations became. The revelation of the incident with Bob McNeil provides the missing key to the case. But it also raises a tragic question: was Esther Cox haunted by a ghost? Or was she being punished twice, first by a man with a gun, and then by the very energy of her own survival? As we move toward the aftermath of the case, we see a woman desperate to outrun a shadow that bore the name of her attacker, leading to a conclusion that was as much a legal tragedy as it was a supernatural one. The mystery of Bob was solved, but the nightmare he triggered was far from over. By the end of 1879, the patience of the Amherst community had reached its limit. The Teed cottage was no longer a home, but a scarred shell of a building, its walls blackened by soot and its furniture reduced to splinters. The final blow came not from the invisible world, but from the very tangible pressure of local law. Mr. Bliss, the owner of the property, issued a stark ultimatum: either Esther Cox left the premises, or the entire Teed family would be evicted. With no other options, Esther was moved to a nearby farm owned by the Van Amberg family. For a brief period, the silence returned, and it seemed the entity had stayed behind on Princess Street. However, the peace was shattered when the Van Amberg's barn was suddenly engulfed in flames, burning to the ground in a matter of hours. Despite Esther's claims that the entity, Bob, had started the fire to punish her, the local authorities had to act. In a trial that drew spectators from across the province, Esther was convicted of arson and sentenced to 4 months in jail. It was a tragic turn for a young woman already burdened by trauma. The justice system of the time saw only the match in her hand, not the invisible force that may have compelled it. Interestingly, during her time in prison, the manifestations reportedly ceased entirely. Whether this was due to the thick stone walls of the jail, a shift in Esther's mental state, or the entity losing interest in a confined target, remains a point of intense debate. Public sympathy eventually swung back in her favor, and she was released after serving only 1 month of her sentence, realizing that she could never truly return to the life she knew in Amherst. Esther eventually moved away, seeking anonymity in a different part of the country. Historical records indicate that she married twice and raised a family, living a relatively quiet and normal life far from the prying eyes of psychic researchers and sensationalist newspapers. It is said that in her later years, the bangs and the scratches never returned. The Great Amherst Mystery effectively ended the moment Esther Cox was allowed to heal in peace, lending further weight to the theory that the haunting was intrinsically tied to a specific, turbulent period of her youth. Despite the quiet end to Esther's personal story, the questions raised by the case continue to echo. The Great Amherst Mystery remains one of the most well-documented poltergeist cases in history, primarily because of the diversity of the witnesses. We are not just dealing with the testimony of a frightened girl, but with the detailed journals of a professional actor, the clinical notes of a respected physician, and the sworn statements of local laborers. If we dismiss the events as a mere hoax, we must explain how Esther, a girl with no formal training in stage magic or chemistry, could cause pillows to move against the strength of grown men, or make solid plaster walls ignite. If we accept the events as real, we are forced to confront a reality where human emotion can warp the physical world, or where predatory entities can latch onto our deepest traumas. Was it a haunting, or was it a biological discharge of extreme stress? Esther Cox passed away in 1912, taking the absolute truth of those nights on Princess Street to her grave. Today, the site of the cottage remains a point of pilgrimage for those fascinated by the unexplained. Though the original structure is long gone, we are left with the scraggly letters on a phantom wall and the chilling reminder that sometimes the scars we carry on the inside can manifest as fires on the outside. The Great Amherst Mystery serves as a bridge between the spiritualism of the Victorian era and the psychological inquiries of the modern age. It reminds us that behind every ghost story is a human being struggling to survive an experience that defies language. As the Atlantic winds continue to sweep through the streets of Amherst, one can't help but wonder if the shadows ever truly left, or if they are simply waiting for the next heart to break. Thank you for joining us in the Tape Library. Sleep well, and keep the lights on.